Good afternoon, and welcome to the 2021-22 Frank Untermyer Lecture and Awards Ceremony. My name is Cammie McBride, and I am the Dean of the Roosevelt University College of Arts and Sciences. Thank you for joining us today as we celebrate faculty members of Roosevelt's past and present, Frank Untermyer and Dr. Sandra Frink. Before we dive into the presentation, I will read a statement acknowledging the land that Roosevelt inhabits, as it is essential that we recognize the indigenous peoples whose land was taken. Roosevelt University is positioned on the traditional unceded homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations. Many other tribes, such as the Miami, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sac, and Fox, also call this area home. Today, Chicago is home to one of the largest urban indigenous communities in the United States. With this land acknowledgement, the Roosevelt University community honors, with gratitude, this land and the indigenous people who have stewarded it through the generations. We recognize the indigenous people who laid the foundation for the city we inhabit, as well as the diverse indigenous nations that reside here today. We vow to do our part to right the historic wrongs of colonization, to support indigenous communities' struggles for self-determination, and to be better stewards of the land that we inhabit. Now, it is my honor to introduce Amy Likover, the daughter of Frank and Ethel Untermyer, and the founder of the Frank Untermyer Excellence in Teaching Award. Amy established this award in 2006 as a meaningful way to keep her father's spirit alive. Frank was a founding faculty member of Roosevelt and professor emeritus of political science and African studies. The award recognizes an excellent teacher whose academic focus lies in social sciences. Amy will now share a few words about her parents.
Thank you, Cammie. It is my pleasure to be here today as a committed and distinguished Roosevelt University educator is honored with the Frank Untermyer Excellence in Teaching Award. This endowed award is meant to hold up outstanding teachers in one of the disciplines my father taught and or valued during his 36 years at Roosevelt: history, political science, constitutional law, African politics, and African American studies. I'm tuning in today from my own classroom at San Rafael High School in California. My father, Frank, was one of the groundbreaking first generation of idealistic Roosevelt professors, and I quote, "Professor Untermyer wanted to be part of Roosevelt's mission from the moment he heard about how the university had been founded, out of protest against discriminatory admission practices at the Central YMCA College." So he came to Roosevelt directly from serving in the Army and after receiving his BA at Cornell. Another quote from Roosevelt's website, Untermyer was a friend and a colleague to the legendary Roosevelt anthropologist and sociologist, St. Clair Drake, a family friend, and he maintained many historic papers from their years together. In addition to teaching at Roosevelt, my father taught at the University of Accra in Ghana, the University College in Tanzania, and he shared Drake's hope that Africans educated in democratic law and history would transform the African continent. But it was in his classroom where my father inspired generations of leaders and future teachers. A devoted instructor, he was at heart a romantic humanist who helped students understand politics and law through literature and history. If you were in Untermyer's classes, you knew the Constitution, you knew the Emancipation Proclamation, the Bill of Rights, Alexis de Tocqueville, you knew the Federalist Papers, Shakespeare, Chinua Achebe, Frederick Douglass, Kafka, Mark Twain, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and Voltaire, among many others. He was an inspiring and motivated educator and a humble man, committed to international education with a focus on democracy. He, of course, met my mother, Ethel, at Roosevelt, and she was always inspired by his teaching. Just this week, I learned from an RU graduate who was inspired to teach others that after meeting a delegation from the Kenyan Department of Education at a picnic at our house, hosted by my father and mother, he was inspired to also teach others. I was 13 then, and I'm 70 now. Excellent teaching leaves a legacy for generations, as you know. The award announcement highlights the centrality of a great, of the dialogue between a great teacher and an eager student. Student evaluations of Dr. Sandra Frink's courses consistently point to her ability to foster vigorous class discussions. She exemplifies the spirit of my father's teaching, dedicated to teaching learners and the importance of history. Congratulations, Professor Frink. Today you are honored with Roosevelt's Frank Untermyer Excellence in Teaching Award. Thank you, Cami.
Thank you, Amy. We are so very grateful for your ongoing support to Roosevelt, and we are honored to help recognize the amazing work of your father. Thank you again.
You're welcome.
And now we shall welcome Dr. Sandra Frink, Associate Professor of History and Director of Women's and Gender Studies. Dr. Sandra Frink is this year's Frank Untermyer Excellence in Teaching Award recipient. Sandra's dedication to using history to investigate the lives of those left out of much of the historical narrative is evident in the impressive selection of courses she has developed. For example, in Race and Sex in Jamestown, she asks students why Plymouth Rock is the colony that forms the basis of the U.S. origin story, rather than Jamestown, the first colony to import slaves. This course, combined with others entitled Urban Life in the 19th Century, Slavery and Freedom, and History Outside the Classroom, Engaging, Empowering History, are a worthy continuation of the legacy of Professor Untermyer. Professor Frink's courses reflect close attention to pedagogy and are praised by her students and colleagues for the time and attention paid to course design. Join me in congratulating Dr. Sandra Frink for being selected as this year's awardee. We now turn to the lecture, Transforming the Future Through Narratives of the Past, which asks how students can be engaged in the discovery and creation of history, and how can we reflect on the significance of history in our present and future. Professor Frink will spend approximately 25 minutes presenting her work. He will then take questions from the audience. You may submit your questions using the comment features within YouTube, Facebook, or LinkedIn. Sandra, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Cami, for that introduction. And thank you, Amy, for keeping your father's legacy alive with this program and award. I'm really honored to be receiving it, and I can only hope that my efforts do justice to your father's legacy. So as Cami mentioned, I've been asked to speak for about 25 minutes about my approach to teaching. And then I understand there will be time for questions. So let's get to it. I think we'll just bring up the PowerPoint. Perfect. Okay, so the title of my presentation is Transforming the Future Through Narratives of the Past. Now, that seems really lofty, but let's see how this goes. If there's an overarching theme in my talk today, it is the power of stories and how engaging in historical narratives can be a means of discussing ideas about social justice and then acting upon them in our present world. In keeping with that theme, and to explain why I teach the way I do, I'm going to share with you the story of why I teach history. So next slide, please. Perfect, thanks. Okay, growing up, I took courses in which I was told about some people and events that happened in the past. This, I was told, was history. It never occurred to me to ask why we were learning about certain people or events. I didn't dislike what I learned necessarily, but I had no sense that history had anything to do with me. History simply existed, and simply put, it told someone else's story. The alienation I felt also stemmed from how it was shared. An instructor told us what we needed to know, and we sat and listened passively. There was no journey of discovery in the classroom because the journey had already taken place. I realize this account of my past makes the prospect of my becoming a history teacher seem rather dubious. And in truth, it was a winding path. But I share this story because I often sense that my students still feel that same alienation I felt many years ago. They still enter my course as freshmen, expecting me to lecture on the stock US history narrative, marching through time from one notable to the next. They still expect the history to be static and unquestioned. And they still think I'm going to tell someone else's story. For me, two things happened. First, I took a women's history course. And this was a revelation because suddenly people like me, regular people, had a story. And it opened up entirely new possibilities. The prospect of telling stories about people that had not been included in what I had understood as history, or even just telling the story in a different way. This experience led me on the path to becoming a social and cultural historian. Second, I came to Roosevelt University. I don't think I would have grown as much as a teacher had I been somewhere else. I have colleagues who are always supportive of new classes and experimental approaches, and always willing to talk about teaching. And I've had small classes with students that I was able to get to know and grow with together. They inspired me to try to break the mold of teaching history. And to break that mold, I knew that the students and we needed to work on creating the story together. I wanted all of us to share in the power of feeling oneself not only represented in the stories we tell, but to have a hand in crafting those stories. Now, we certainly don't just make them up. We spend time in class breaking down what historians do so that we can become part of the process. This process requires us to analyze evidence and to frame an argument. But it also takes an open mind, an active imagination, and an empathetic disposition. Of course, our students have all of that. My role is simply to foster an environment for them to. So next slide, please. To show you what this looks like in practice, I'm going to talk about two of my courses, a freshman level survey course in US history and an upper division experiential course about public history. I structure both around three activities we participate in together: defining history, discovering history, and creating history. I will show you what this looks like in each course and then explain why I hope this all leads to a fourth goal, even after they leave the class: transforming the future. But first, we must define what history is. So next slide, please. We start with a simple premise. History is the story we tell, and I will explain. History does not exist outside of the narratives we create. It is out there, but it's not like it's just waiting to be found. And it can never be completely recovered. It's certainly not just a collection of facts. Instead, history is the story of people and events that we tell ourselves. And the narrative we tell reflects our values, our politics, and even our visions of the future. My desire is to reject the idea of history as a top-down, omniscient narrative, something created by some to the exclusion of others. Instead, I want students to know that they too could have a role in shaping our knowledge of the past. And to that end, I've included here a photograph of the bust of Jean-Baptiste du Sable, which is on the north end of the Michigan Avenue Bridge. Now, we may all recognize him as the founder of Chicago. Some always have. However, it took the Chicago City Council until 2006 to officially recognize du Sable as the founder of the city. It took until 2009 to have this bust of du Sable put on the bridge. And after decades of demands, the city finally renamed Lakeshore Drive after him just this past summer. There's still an effort underway to have a larger statue of du Sable made and placed in the city. The point here is that this public recognition and honor only happened because regular people fought to make it happen. They are making sure that his story becomes more widely acknowledged and known. And that is what I want my students to do as well, to find their voice and engage in the debate over how our stories are told. Getting there requires a shift in the classroom, from me talking at them to all of us joining in together to reflect on the way history is remembered. And I will provide an example of what this might look like in each of the classes I am discussing today. So next slide, please. On the first day of my survey course in US history, this is US history to 1865, we talk about the narrative of US history that we are told. I asked them to think of words they associate with the era of contact, a purposefully vague phrase to describe the period roughly from the 1400s to the 1600s. And this is an example of a list taken from a class I taught recently. And I'll give you a few moments to look it over. In some ways, it is not a surprising list. There are a lot of terms we might expect. They're so unsurprising, perhaps, that we don't even consider how their use shapes the story. But of course, this is what we need to do. So in class, we break it down and ask questions about our choice of words. For example, how does the word discovery privilege certain perspectives over others? Or how do we square words like adventure with words like devastating? And who is excluded from the narrative? You may have noticed that no one mentioned Indigenous Americans. What does the story look like from their perspective? This exercise gives us a first taste into how history is created. We can ask ourselves why we have been told what we've been told. We can reflect on the assumptions that we're bringing to the class. And we can think about how those assumptions shape the questions we ask and the information we look for. And we can see how our choice of words or our framing of the story shapes our understanding of the past. Next slide, please. In my experiential course in public history, we delve a bit deeper into the factors and forces that impact our ability to tell different historical narratives, including the role of the archives. And for this reason, I have included a photograph of the Historic New Orleans collection, an archive where I've conducted a lot of research. It is beautiful and grand and incredibly intimidating. In fact, a lot of archives are notoriously unapproachable. If you don't have a lot of credentials to legitimize your being there, it's easy to feel like you don't belong, like you're an outsider. Of course, archives are wonderful repositories for historical sources, and they certainly deserve respect. However, it is important that we understand their role in determining whose story is deemed important enough to remember and to preserve, which then contributes to determining whose story is written about and whose story is taught. It has also meant that the records of many people, historical figures who could not legitimize their presence in the archives, were barred from entry and thrown out. These decisions are difficult to undo, and some stories have been lost forever. As a class, we examine these issues at play in making decisions and preserving the past. Of course, rethinking how history is constructed is just the beginning. To actually start participating as historians, we need to dive into the sources themselves, which requires a whole other set of skills and insights. And I refer to this as discovering history. So next slide, please. So I'm just reinventing the wheel here in saying that active learning is more engaging and impactful. But perhaps the act of going into the field is not as readily apparent in history since we can't time travel yet. But until then, historians read old sources. Some, like letters, can tell us the innermost feelings and values of a person. But others, like ship manifests, tell us painfully little about those who may have traveled on them, such as indentured servants or the enslaved. Regardless, looking at the actual sources is crucial. First, they help us identify with those in the past. Simultaneously, they help us recognize how very different the past was from our present. Basically, it prompts us to respect the past as the past. And significantly, it brings contingency back. If we can transport ourselves into their world, we can see what their choices may have been and how their decisions shaped the future. This is hard work. It can take a long time to unravel the meaning of a one-page document. It requires taking intellectual and creative chances. But students always have fresh insights to share. And this is how it would look in both of these classes. So next slide, please. In my freshman survey course, we learn about the story of Hannah Duston. Duston was a colonial English woman from the 1600s, a mother of 8, who was taken captive by an indigenous group, the Abenaki, during a raid. After being marched about 150 miles and witnessing the murder of her newborn child, she escaped. She escaped by killing 10 of her captors, 2 men, 2 women, and 6 children. After she escaped, she went back and she scalped them, for which she received a hefty bounty upon the return to her village. Students read 2 very different accounts of her life. One from her lifetime that celebrates her bravery, and another from the 1800s that condemns her actions. The students also consider the broader context of her life and debate the choices she may have had. Her story reveals a lot about colonialism, gender, violence, love. But instead of telling them what her story means, I have them work it out amongst themselves. And Hannah Duston has the distinction of being the first woman in the US honored with a statue. She actually has quite a few memorials, and they even kept her hatchet, which is now in a museum. This particular statue depicts her in her bedclothes with her hatchet in one hand and the scalps in the other. Next slide, please. In my experiential course on public history, we actually visit the archives. The last time I taught it, we went to the DuSable Museum. So I have included a picture of their very grand building, which houses the archive and museum. And I should point out that they are very welcoming, so you should all visit. At the time I offered the class, the Smithsonian was working in partnership with the museum to promote public history. So we went to a number of public history events. We went to a genealogy lecture and workshop. We also attended a digital records event, which is when people from the community can bring their documents and have them scanned. And significantly, we worked with the Dr. Charles Hamilton Archival Collection. And I just want to note all of the Roosevelt connections that were at play in making this happen. I was introduced to Skylar Hearn, the archivist at the time, by one of our notable alums in history, Tracy Drake. Dr. Charles Hamilton is also a Roosevelt alum and former faculty member who has led a remarkable life as a political scientist, activist, and professor. And while we were visiting the archive one weekend, we happened to run into Professor Christopher Reed, an alum of Roosevelt and an emeritus faculty member in history from Roosevelt. Overall, it was a great experience, and everyone in the class agreed that there's nothing comparable to touching old letters, news clippings, and photographs. They transport you back in time and make the past tangible. The experience also gave the students an idea of what it's like to be a public historian. Once we have fully explored all the sources, it's time to pull the narrative together to create history. So next slide, please. No matter what level of history course you are in, you can make history. In my freshman courses, these tend to be short assignments, often done in groups and then presented to the class. In my upper division courses, these would be larger semester-long projects that allow students to invest in the issues and dive into the details. Regardless of the size of the project, students find their voice and they enter the conversation, telling and retelling stories from a fresh perspective. And on the next slide, I have provided examples of what this looks like in each of the classes. So next slide, please. In the US History Survey course, I give them a possible real-life scenario. In this case, I tell them that they are serving on a state commission to determine how the Massachusetts State Historical Society should frame their exhibit on Hannah Duston. They are granted the power to convey to the public the significance of this event and talk about her experience. They consider questions such as, how should this history be presented? Whose perspective should be highlighted? What should be included? All of these questions require choices that ultimately shape the narrative. So they work in groups and then present their decisions to the class. In my experiential course on public history, each student proposes a public history project. The projects were not only creative, but significantly, most of them sprang from each student's family or community history. Some of them included an exhibit for veterans of the student's church, an arts-based community center for children in honor of the student's uncle, a Black Chicago artist, an app that would allow people to vote on statues and art installations in Grant Park, a flavor of immigrants walking food tour, which was centered in Pilsen, and an LGBTQ+ oral history project. And there were many others. In both classes, we take ownership of the past, not to distort it, but to shine a light on stories that have not been told, to rethink stories we know well, and sometimes just to simply become part of the conversation. Which brings us to the future. And our final slide, if you could. I think it can be dangerous to overemphasize the phrase history repeats itself. I think it erases the complexity of historical context. Nevertheless, I do think that understanding how people acted in the past and why can help us make decisions now and in the future when similar issues confront us. I think we are all more interested in history than we realize, and also that we are invested in what it says about ourselves and how we got here. Sometimes it is depressing, sometimes it is inspiring, but it is always a way for us to better understand ourselves. As I mentioned earlier, I became a history teacher in large part because of the first women's history course I took in college. So, fittingly, I will close with a comment one of my students wrote in the fall of 2020 at the end of a women's history course that I taught. Quote, "The stories from the past have motivated me to keep fighting for the rights of women, to be vocal and to create an uproar. However, it has also taught me to be more accepting of other women's choices. And reading the slaves' narratives and stories has also taught me to be grateful for the life I have." Unquote. History may be complicated and confounding, but if it inspires my students to create an uproar, I feel like I have done my job. And that concludes my talk. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Sandra. I would like to take one of your classes now, so can you save me a seat in your classes this spring, perhaps? All right, we have some questions. I have some questions, and then we also have some questions from the audience. One question I'd like to ask you is, what's your very favorite part about teaching history, and what's your less favorite part about teaching history?
All right. Well, let's start with the least favorite first so we can just get that over with. And I mean, I wish I could come up with something sort of interesting, but I think I'm going to come up with something that is pretty common. And that's, of course, grading. I mean, I think that assessment is important, but grading is sort of emotionally draining. It makes you feel all of the anxiety that I think maybe the students feel about grades. So that is my least favorite. My most favorite, let's see if I can express this in a way that makes sense. When I see students like 3 months or 6 months or even years after they've taken one of my classes, when they mention something that they remember from the class, I think that makes me just feel like I've somehow made a difference in their lives. That just happened actually last week. I was teaching my immigration course, and I was trying to think of a term to explain the experience of a Chinese immigrant that we were discussing. And suddenly a student in my class said, "Oh, I know that phrase. It's from your class last year." And it was a double bind, but whatever the context, the point is that she remembered and brought it into the class. And I actually had a student come to me years later and say, "You know what? I finally get that book that you had us read. It's one of my favorite books, Silencing the Past, and it's a difficult read." And she had thought about it even years later, and was like, "Yep, I get it now." So I guess that's my favorite.
Excellent, excellent. So here's a question from the audience. What does your method do to students who enter your class feeling alienated from traditional representations of history?
I'm actually just looking at that question too, so I can. Right. So I think a couple ways. I think I'll outline 3 ways, just very briefly. First, the course looks at the experiences of many different people in the past, and that shakes up the US history narrative. It just does. Because when you look at the history from, say, the perspective of a Native American, then that history looks very different, and the timeline is different. You know, the markers of importance are even different. So I try to, I don't know if I love this term, but I try and be inclusive in what we teach. And then also I give them a voice. We have discussions from day one. They never stop. Some students are not, thrilled with that because they feel like maybe I'm breaking some unwritten contract that is expected in a history course, or at least one that they had in high school where they were just lectured to and they didn't have to think about anything until the midterm or the final or whatever. But I think that if students have the ability to voice their thoughts about it, then they start to feel like they have more power and control in the classroom. Students have opinions about things. So if you can create the environment where they feel comfortable expressing themselves, then I think then they start to open up.
I imagine it's probably very empowering for students to be in your class.
I hope so.
Can you say a little bit more? Here's another question. Can you say a little bit more about how you shift the classroom? I think probably this questioner is referring to from sort of the traditional ways of and encountering history to how you're presenting it.
Right. So the first thing is just that I don't lecture anymore, or I lecture as little as possible. And so the background material that they need, and they do need it because that provides a lot of the context.
Mm-hmm.
That background material is online, and they can look it over in advance. It's not. I don't use a textbook because no one reads them anyway, and it sort of locks you into a narrative that I'm trying to break free of. So my context provides them with different pieces of information that then they're going to be able to bring to the discussion. And then I assign a primary source for every classroom, for every class. And so the primary source might be, say, an exchange between a Native American and an English person in the 1600s. Or it may be a excerpt from a narrative, a slave narrative. But whatever it is, they read those, and then we spend the time in the classroom in different activities discussing them. Sometimes we have debates. We do a lot of group work. They do presentations.
Yeah, I was wondering how you talked about in your presentation giving students a better context of the history. So that response helps me understand how you're doing that. Has there been a particular instance when perhaps your students' perspectives have challenged you to rethink your own thoughts or teaching practices in the classroom?
Definitely the first one. Challenge you to rethink your own thoughts. I mean, I think that's one of the real beauties of teaching, and maybe teaching at Roosevelt. I don't know. But when you start creating the classroom where the students do feel comfortable talking, then they have these incredible insights that do, I mean, they're kernels of analysis, I guess, is what I'll say, that I haven't heard really from other historians. So yes, I think that they constantly enrich what we all think about history, and definitely how I teach history. I mean, things that students have told me just years ago that still impact how I think about the past. Teaching practices, sure. I mean, there are some days where I just walk out of the classroom on cloud 9 because I'm so happy a discussion went really well. And then there are some days where whatever I planned did not work. And yeah, so I think that it's a constant revision and thinking about your practices, what kinds of discussions work, what kind of questions even work.
Yeah, yeah. In that vein, what are some historical events that are being amended now? I guess how a modern understanding of them has changed from how they've been understood in the past, perhaps.
Right. Well, I'm teaching 2 courses right now where those issues are at play. I am the U.S. History Survey in 1865. I mean, I guess that covers a lot, but we are right in the midst of discussing the 1619 project. And I don't know how much detail I should go into it here, but it was a public history project by Nicole Hannah-Jones from the New York Times. And it has really shined a light on the experience of Africans in America. Now, I mean, we could look back, to 1526 and other experiences of Africans in the Americas, but certainly for U.S. history, it's a really important project, and we are going to be debating that, looking at it next week. So that's just one. And then I'm teaching a course on the Civil War in history and memory. And so, yeah, we are in the midst of pulling down some statues and reconsidering the leaders that we've honored. But I think, more broadly, and something my class is talking about, is that the Civil War has always been understood and studied from the battlefield. And more historians are looking at other aspects of the war, things like the home front, women's experiences, spies. And so that is something that we are really trying to draw out and, I think amend the record.
Tell us a little bit about the other classes that you're teaching. You mentioned a class on the Civil War, a class on immigration. I know there were some other interesting courses. I think there was one on an oral history project or a course on oral history. Could you speak about that as well?
Yeah, I started teaching oral history, I don't know, a while ago now, maybe 8 or 9 years ago, but it's evolved over time. And when I teach it, then we focus on a different group, then we do oral histories with a different group of people every time. And oral history is one of those historical research methods that's so important for drawing out voices from the past that have really been overlooked, that you can't find in the history books. So it's been a really valuable, rewarding class for me and for the students. I have taught it with a focus on immigrants, and this is a testament to our Roosevelt students and the diversity here. But the students, I would say that maybe 80% of them were able to interview family members because they had family members that were immigrants. And what you realize when you interview a family member is that there are a lot of stories and a lot of things that you just don't know until you actually sit down and ask them. So that was really rewarding. I've also taught it with a focus on women, and I will be doing that in the spring as well, an oral history class on women. And then this past spring, we had a class on basically the year of the pandemic. It was called Documenting COVID. And we interviewed friends, family, community members that about their experiences in the year 2020.
That sounds amazing. That method and what it can reveal and again provide to us. This sounds so incredible. Here's another question from the audience. Could you speak to any challenging pedagogical, relational, classroom dynamic factors that may arise in class sessions? What are, I guess, challenging things that come up during class sessions?
There's so many. I'm just trying to think of.
But yeah.
Yeah. I suppose to some degree, I don't know if this is pedagogical. I think that teaching in the past there's just a lot of distressing things that happened in the past. And I do think that conveying them with sensitivity and talking about them with sensitivity is really important. And I do think it's a challenge. I think it's a challenge for us to try and find the words to express ourselves and to talk about those experiences in the past. The past is so different than our present, but when we study it, and it's really it's easy to feel like they're just us, but they're just back then, but they're not. And I think that it's a hard challenge to try and both think about our present time and what we're bringing to the conversation, and also try and understand what it might have been like in the past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sounds a deeper understanding of the context and how important context is. That matters. Speaking of distressing things that come up from the past, what do your students say about Hannah Duston? How do they represent her after that activity that you have them do?
Right. Okay. So I should just tell you that some of the other contexts we discuss related to Hannah Duston, and we look at some of the other memorials to her, but we look at other opinions about her, even from the present time, because she gets a lot of attention. I mean, most people have never heard of her, but
I heard not.
Once in a while, she just rises up and there's talk about her, and then she disappears again. Mm-hmm. There have been a number of filmmakers who've wanted to make films of her life, mm-hmm. and they call her a feminist hero. And so there's that. But then there's the Abenaki, who have expressed their horror and their disillusionment that she's still celebrated and honored in so many ways, and they would like a different story told. Mm-hmm. I'll be honest, the students, they don't fall one way or another. Mm-hmm. I think they would like to. I feel almost bad trying to condense their views, but for example, the last time I taught it, then a lot of students were like, well, she was brave and she was distressed about her newborn child being killed, and she wanted to get back to her family, but she shouldn't have done what she'd done. Mm-hmm. And that's what that would be the best scenario. And of course, that's not what happened. So they struggle with it, actually, Mm-hmm. And I mean, if a student were to come up to me today and say, you know what, I've changed my mind again about Hannah Duston, I think that would be fine. I think that would be probably good.
Yeah. It's complicated. There aren't easy ways to think about it. Could you give some more details about your students' projects in making history? Perhaps some of the oral history during COVID, or what they've unearthed, or maybe some of the immigrant stories?
Sure. So in the documenting COVID, then I had the students do a group project, and group projects are notoriously disliked, but I just think that I think they're wonderful. I think it takes a lot of effort to work with the groups and to make sure that they understand their roles in the process, and keep them on track, and so devote some class time to making sure that they can work together and discuss what they need to discuss. But the students worked in groups and they had access to all of the oral histories from the class. And so I think we ended up with maybe about 48 oral histories total. And so those were, everyone had access to them. And each group was asked to provide a narrative of the year using only the oral histories to tell the story. So they weren't writing the narrative. They were literally just using quotes to take the reader through the year. And so what they had to do is they had to read the oral histories. They had to think about the themes that were shared between the different oral histories and decide, what topics they really wanted to focus in on. And then they needed to determine what quotes to use and how to excerpt the quotes so that it flowed in some sort of narrative form. And this is sort of like a kind of a radically democratic way of having the people whose stories are being told actually have that voice. You're just allowing their voices to be heard instead of trying to mediate it in any way. So each group did that, and they ended up including photographs. One of them included original artwork. So they're really beautiful. In fact, we had to do this all, of course, via Zoom.
Right.
So I'm still hoping that I can get the class back together in person, and maybe invite the people that we interviewed to come as well, and just kind of have a celebration and actually meet one another in person.
Sure. Yeah, I hope that the product of their work somehow lives on as well. Maybe you show it to future classes.
Oh, I should say that Laura Mills and the archives at Roosevelt have already agreed to make sure that we can put those in the archive. So
that's wonderful. That's wonderful. We have a few more questions in the time that we have left. So what do you hope that your way of teaching history will do to our future? How do you imagine this? I think it's going to make a difference, but how do you envision it making a difference to what happens to us going forward?
I think that part of it is that I hope that students in the future, after they've taken my class, are still invested in history because they know that, they have the tools to be able to find out more about it, to, fact check, validate what people are saying, or disprove it. So they have those skills, but also just that they recognize it out there, that they're interested, So, one of the things about the bust of DuSable is that it's sort of in a busy area. And I just sort of feel like it should be, grander. They should have a space, bigger space for him. So, like maybe my students will agitate for that in the future. But yeah, and certainly just not accept the narratives that they're told, to feel like they can still become part of the process.
Related to what you're just saying, can you say more about how we are all more interested in history than we realize? I imagine there's some students who take your class thinking, oh, I don't like history. But you said people are actually more interested than they realize. How do people realize that?
I think that's one of the barriers that I try to overcome, is that, I think sometimes people take my U.S. history course because they had U.S. history in high school, so they just figure it'll be an easy, it'll be easy. They kind of know it already, but they're not really interested in it. And I think that I think it's partly the profession's fault, honestly. I think that we write for each other and we don't really find a way to make it accessible or meaningful to the public. And that's not to say that there aren't, documentaries by Ken Burns and others. There's great documentaries out there. But those that are doing really, really fascinating research in history are not always being heard by the larger public. And so this is all to say that I think that if we found ways to share this information, I think that there would be interest, because I think people do want it. I think when they learn about it, then they are fascinated. We tell our own histories all the time, and they're constantly changing. If I were to tell you my life story today, then it would be different 5 years from now or 10 years from now. History is always changing. And so I think that the more interested than we realize is, I think that we just need to find ways to share it.
Sure. I think we have time for one more question before we have to finish. Have you considered teaching a course specifically on the oral history of great Roosevelt faculty and alumni, such as St. Clair Drake, Frank Untermyer, Mayor Harold Washington, Dempsey Travis, and many more? That would be a great class.
Oh, that would be so great. I would love to do that. Can't maybe do an oral history project with some of them, but certainly with their family members, with Amy, right? I mean, I think that would be wonderful. I also, the next time I teach about the course in the archives, I would actually like to use the Roosevelt archives, if that's at all possible. I think that would be really wonderful to do. And maybe it could lead to a public exhibit at Roosevelt, of items that my students find. I think that would be really fun. Yeah, I'll do it.
Awesome. That sounds great. That sounds awesome. Well, thank you so much. I actually learned quite a bit today, and I'm only half kidding about wanting to take your class. Thank you also to Amy for supporting, this award, and I think it was very well deserved. So thank you very much for your presentation today, and thank you everyone who tuned in to listen to us. That concludes our presentation for today. So thank you again, Sandra.
Thank you.